Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Zahid from Toxic Innovation Valley, and today we have very amazing guest with us, Katya Fisher. Katya Fisher is the Executive Vice Chairman of Constructor Group and member of the Executive Board at Constructor University. First of all, I really warm welcome you, Katya Fisher. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Before we jump to the topic and the questions, Katya Fisher, I would love to know your personal story, your inspirational story. How was your entrepreneurial journey so far? Tell us and tell the audience about from where you got your early education, your higher education, and then from where you started your professional journey, and now you are an executive vice chairman. This is a very top level responsibility and leadership role. So, how all that gone, and what were your learnings and what were the challenges? Tell us whole story, please.
Okay, I'll tell you the whole story. So, I was born in New York City. I grew up between New York, Princeton, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. I went to college at NYU, so back to New York again. And after NYU, I studied law at Cardozo Law School. I wasn't really sure what kind of a lawyer I wanted to be, and because of that, I studied a little bit of everything. I thought I wanted to go into the art world, so I did a lot with IP and art matters. And then at some point, I took a tax law class and a corporate law class, and to my absolute surprise and shock, that's where I got my best grades. I had never really anticipated that those were going to be the types of things that would be really interesting for me. And yet, all of a sudden, I understood that it was a just really, really exciting field to really understand corporate law, to understand taxation, to understand how business works. I graduated during the economic crisis. My generation of law graduates was known as sort of the lost generation at the time. It was very, very hard to find employment. So while I worked in some law firms in the beginning of my career, I went out on my own and started my own law practice at a very, very early stage in my career, which was terrifying. It wasn't what I was planning on my career looking like. And it was definitely a learning experience every single day, but it also got me to where I am. So over the years, I started out with very small clients, and then my practice grew, my reputation grew, my confidence grew. And eventually, a few years ago, I became a partner in a national US law firm in order to kind of move to the next level and be able to offer my clients more comprehensive services. Even during that time, I always felt extremely entrepreneurial because I was so accustomed to building my business, to having to figure everything out on my own, to having to set everything up from scratch, that I started to realize that I might be more of a business person even than I am a lawyer. I met the founder of Constructor, Serge Bell, when I spoke at a conference some years ago in Florida. And we started talking back and forth for a while, and then he invited me to come and serve within his companies. And at the time, Constructor was just being built. It was a brand new project, and it seemed like a very, very exciting thing to be a part of because it had so many elements and facets and people and technology, everything, that I decided to come on board because I thought it would be really, really fun to see what it's like to be on the inside of a company that's going to be growing at such a fast pace and something that could be much larger than myself. So I started out, I didn't really have any title. The first thing he told me was, I don't know what to do with you, so go make yourself useful. And I guess I made myself useful over time because now here I am. So that's the story.
Wow, so amazing and so inspirational, Katya. And many, many congratulations for all your learnings and all your achievements so far. So, Katya, can you please tell us a bit more about your background and experience in startup world? Because you know that um, Our today's topic is startup essentials, tax and legal considerations. So before we jump to the technical questions, can you
Mhm.
please tell a little bit of your experience in the startup world?
Sure. So over the years, I've worked with many startups from many countries worldwide in the technology industry, but also not necessarily. Although now my focus, I guess, is almost exclusively tech and education. Working in the startup world is really exciting for me. I find it to be a lot of fun. I think the type of energy and the type of personalities necessary for a startup to be successful are just extremely different from other industries or late stage companies. And so for me, it's always just so exciting to see people having to be creative, build things from scratch, wear multiple hats, figure out solutions to problems on the fly, and move very fast and not be afraid to fail and make mistakes and pick themselves up again day in, day out. For me, more established companies are not as exciting because of the fact that you don't have that kind of room to be creative and figure out what you want to do each day. So I really enjoy it. I enjoy working with startups. I enjoy helping and advising them. At a certain point, obviously, you see many patterns. And so it makes you better at your job over time because experience allows you then to really, really be able to help those companies and the people running them to do what they do best.
Right. Uh, Katya, what are some common legal considerations that entrepreneurs should keep in mind when starting a new business?
So there are many. I would say that the biggest ones, I would say where I see people focusing and where I think people should focus more. So, first of all, the type of entity, the location of the entity, the structure of the entity, all very important things, all considerations, obviously, because we work in this, international paradigm. So I think that if you are, let's say, Swiss and you live in Switzerland, it's going to make sense to set up a Swiss entity. If you're German and you live in Germany, if you're American and you live in the United States, but if you have partners worldwide, if you have different interests, etc., if you have investors who are coming from a different jurisdiction than where you are, those considerations can come into play and it can become more complicated. I would say that unless you're quite sophisticated in the very beginning, it doesn't matter. Make sure you have an entity, make sure your IP is assigned to that entity, make sure it's functioning, make sure you have a good accountant, and paperwork is in order, but I wouldn't worry too much about structure. I do see sometimes people in the very beginning, they focus a lot on that when that's something really that can come later. Where I think people don't focus enough and where they really should is the quality and the nature of their relationships with their partners. When you're going into a business deal, when you're founding a company and you're not doing it by yourself and you have partners, right, co-founders, those relationships and the quality of those relationships are to a great extent going to dictate the success of that company. And therefore, not having good paperwork in place, not having good expectations of each other, not having clarity in terms of those expectations, that's where you can really see down the line a lot of legal issues that come up. It's usually between people. So I would say that that's one area really to focus on. Make sure that everyone who is a co-founder or partner, or even your employees, your advisors, that there's just a lot of clarity on roles, responsibilities, expectations, and pieces of the pie, so to speak.
Right. How can startups ensure that they are structured in a way that is tax efficient and complies with all relevant regulations?
That's a big, big question. So the first thing is, again, being compliant and dealing with all of this. The more international a company becomes, the more complex a company becomes, the more complex this is. this can become a really, really big issue. And that's why, like I said before, sometimes for most startups, it's better to kind of start small, do it right, and build from there. Because the other issue, of course, is that when engaging legal counsel, engaging outside advisors, those costs can be astronomical if you're not careful. The first thing, however, is obviously get yourself a good lawyer and get yourself a good accountant. And don't underestimate the need to have both and the need for them to really talk to each other. One of the things that I have seen in terms of compliance matters that I think can be really challenging for startups if they don't have an experienced team or an in-house lawyer or just experienced people around them is sometimes there can be a gap between advisors. A lot of times, a company might hire one firm that's very well known in doing X, but that firm is not going to go ahead and explain to them, hey, we're just doing X, but we're not going to tell you that you also have to do Y. And that can be really scary for a startup because a lot of times they'll say, well, we would have done this, we just didn't know. And the advisors will come back and say, well, that's not what you hired us to do. So that's something that you have to be really, really careful about, especially if you're a first-time founder, because you might not have the right experience to know what it is that you don't know. How you mitigate this? Lawyer plus accountant. Hopefully you get good recommendations, good referrals. Try to stick with just one entity, one jurisdiction, doing things slowly but surely, and also try to educate yourself and be as knowledgeable as you can be and not always rely 100% on advisors. You should rely on them. You should understand that they're more knowledgeable, more experienced than you are, and that's obviously why you're paying them and why you're engaging them. But you should also use them as an opportunity to educate yourself and to pay attention.
Right. Katya, what are some common mistakes that entrepreneurs often make when it comes to tax and legal considerations?
Common mistakes. So I think a lot of common mistakes are oftentimes like there can be a lot of mistakes, right? People make mistakes. People are prone to making them. Some of the most common ones that I would say on the legal side in the beginning is really just not having paperwork and not being organized. You would be surprised how many startups I've seen, obviously not the ones I represent because we're very organized, but I've seen a lot of startups where you would be surprised that paperwork is missing, documents are missing, things aren't organized, something was done by a handshake and never memorialized on paper. Be proactive, be organized, make sure that you record everything, every detail, because people forget conversations years later, people forget what they promised each other, people get confused, etc. So I would say that that's one area where you see it quite frequently, that in startup companies they'll move very, very fast and therefore they won't have the right backup. I would say that for accounting and tax, it's actually kind of a similar issue as well. You want to have the right backup all the time, because of the fact that a lot of times the things that don't seem like issues now, they become issues down the road. And a lot of times when you have tax and legal issues, those issues, they come up 3 years later, 5 years later, 7 years later. So if you're not organized, if you don't have a good system, if you're not recording decisions, choices, contractual obligations, etc., just wait. Your future self is going to be very unhappy with you.
Right. You advised that startup founders should educate themselves. Can you please share some strategies and tips how startup founders can educate themselves on the bare minimum essentials regarding legal and tax considerations?
Sure.
Any ways to be educated?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's several ways. So first, what I think is an ideal way is use your advisors, right? In the same way that doctors don't like it when their patients come and say, "But doctor, I read this on Google." Lawyers aren't always happy when their clients say that they educated themselves through something that they found on the internet, because it's not always accurate, and or it might not always meet your specific situation. So the first and the best way to educate oneself is ask questions. If you have advisors, if you've hired lawyers, if you've hired tax advisors, ask them. They send you a contract, don't be afraid to say, what does this mean? What does this term mean? What is this I'm signing? What does this clause mean? Learn, use that experience. You might have to spend a little bit of extra time or even a little bit of extra money, but down the road, it's really, really useful, right? I mean, I'm always surprised at how many people sign contract agreements, NDAs, all kinds of documents, and they don't even know what an indemnification clause is. I'll ask them, do you know what indemnification is? They'll say no. So why are you signing a document if you don't understand what the terminology is? The second is, if you're not getting that support from your advisors, or if you can't afford it, or if it's not enough, yes, there is Google. There's ChatGPT now, right? You can ask questions, you can look at blogs. There's so much content out there. You have to take it with a grain of salt, because that content may or may not be relevant for you. It may not meet your particular situation, and it might be incorrect. But that being said, just to get the basics right, just to kind of understand what it is that you're getting yourself into, and what to do, the internet is a great place to start. And there's lots and lots and lots of government websites. I can tell you for the US, I mean, you can go to copyright.gov. It will give you training videos and pamphlets and all kinds of information about intellectual property when it comes to copyright, when it comes to trademark, when it comes to patents. And you'll find similar on other government websites around the world as well.
Right. So, there are different structures and different business entities. Like, it's startup, it's a small or medium business, or it's a big company. So how tax and legal things change when startup, get startup is grown, I mean, goes to the next level and is established, how the tax and legal things change with the passage of time.
So I mean, and more money, more problems, right? So the bigger a company gets, the more challenges it's going to have, the more issues that it's going to be looking at. In the very beginning, legal considerations are very, very basic. Let's say you have, I don't know, four people, four friends get together, they decide to start a company. They go, they register an entity, they have a nice little shareholder agreement among them, and they get started. Several years down the line, let's say they have 600 employees all over the world, they have multiple entities, they're going to be looking at the legal considerations in the various jurisdictions where they're working. They're going to be looking at the employment laws and regulations in all of those different places and making sure that what they're doing is compliant. They're going to be looking at data privacy issues, right? If they're doing business in the EU and the United States, and let's say Singapore, we're dealing with GDPR, we might be dealing with, I don't know, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act in California, and whatever the regulations are in Singapore as well. So that becomes more complicated. Some other legal issues that then arise that you don't have in the beginning, after a certain stage, once a startup starts attracting investment capital. That's when the paperwork starts to become more and more complicated, right? You go through your different rounds of investment, and all of a sudden the cap table becomes bigger and more complicated, and things become challenging. Other areas can be mergers and acquisitions, right? If your company is getting acquired, or if you've gotten so big that your company is now acquiring other businesses, those types of legal considerations are going to become very complex. And at that point, you definitely want to keep educating yourself, right? As I mentioned from the very beginning, but obviously you're going to need a team of real experts who are handling it.
Right. When a startup, raise funding, uh is that fund directly, transferred from the investors to the startup's bank account, or how the things go? I mean, where that fund goes actually, that is sent in the form of cash to the bank account of the startup, or that is just remains with the investors and that is allocated in the budget side of the company expenses? I mean, how the things go when a startup raise funding?
Sure. So I think, first of all, it depends on the paperwork, right? I think that if you are a smart investor, I think if you are wise, you want to know the budget, you might want a board seat with the company, right? Or at the very, very, very least, you want information rights and to understand where your money is going, how it's being allocated, what the budget is for that year. If you can get the board approval, then I mean the right to be on the board. You want to have those approval rights because then you can participate in the budget, and you have some oversight as to the funds and how the funds are being allocated and released over time. Other investors might not have that. They just write a check. The check goes to the company's bank account, and that's it. I mean, I've seen a lot of times situations where you see startup founders who, frankly, they squander money away. I was even watching on I think it was Mark Cuban, right? He was talking about an investment that he had made via his show Shark Tank, where the investment that he made, the founder was just partying all over the world, and he was seeing his like Instagram posts of this guy at all these dinners and events, and he said, oh, it's networking, it's business development, I need it, that's why I need to do these things, and the business was run into the ground. So I think that savvy investors know not to do that. I guess with Mark Cuban, I wouldn't say he's not a savvy investor. I think he's a very savvy investor, but I guess it's just par for the course. And it happens sometimes. So again, it really depends.
Right. Can you discuss any recent changes in the tax and legal requirements, especially in the US region, that you would like to inform to the entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs?
I mean, look, the tax code is changing every year, right? There are legal considerations that are changing all the time. It's really, really depends on the particular company and on the types of projects that they're doing and where they're at in the life cycle of the business. So I wouldn't say there's sort of one thing that everybody should go ahead and take a look at. I would say that there are some areas that seem to me to be more important than maybe they were a decade ago, right? So first of all, I think data privacy. I think that the data privacy realm has really, really shifted in terms of how important it is to have someone in your team who's paying attention to this if you're in tech. And obviously, ultimately, a data privacy officer, chief privacy counsel, these types of things, especially with the GDPR and just all the changes that have been happening in the last few years, and just making sure that compliance is a big part of what a company is looking at. I would say that beyond that, the other kind of big thing that I've seen that's just different from what I used to see in the past is how international everything has become. Right. I mean, I'm a US trained attorney. I'm American, so I have a very kind of US centric view of startups. But again, a decade ago, I mean, all the startups were in Silicon Valley, and they were all registered as Delaware C Corps. And there was sort of a kind of cookie cutter method to these entities. And now, over time, first of all, in the US, you see so many different startups that are being formed in places that are not Silicon Valley, right? Not just New York, but also like Austin, Texas, or Miami, Florida, or other places like that. And so now the considerations, those local considerations, are coming into play. And you also see it internationally as well. And you see a lot of startups coming out of Switzerland and Germany and France and many other places. And that's definitely made the landscape a little bit more complex. than I guess it used to be. But again, there's no one thing that I could tell any startup to go ahead and look at.
Right. So when a startup founder is hiring the partner like the lawyer and accountant, what should a startup founder consider, like as a trait or the qualities? I mean, how a startup founder could decide that which would be the good partner in as an accountant and as a lawyer?
Sure. So I think it depends on the size of the startup and the budget, right? And where the startup is headed. So that informs things a lot. If you're a, small startup and you're an early stage founder with a very, very restricted budget, you might not be able to go ahead and hire the biggest white shoe law firm out there that's going to give all the bells and whistles and do everything beautifully. You'll need to go ahead and work with a much smaller firm. If you're the type of startup that's being built, let's say within a larger ecosystem or has an enormous amount of funding, these sorts of things, then you have different considerations, and it's just a different ball game. So going with the first set, if you're a startup founder on a limited budget, there are a lot of lawyers out there who are now solo practitioners or work in small firms or work in boutique firms who have a lot of experience working in tech. Many of them come from big law and have just decided that they want something smaller and more intimate. Some of them don't. But the first thing that you really want to do is you want to take a look at what companies they've represented. You want to ask what they've done for those companies. You want to get some references, and you want to understand how long they've been with the life cycle of those companies. And you also really want to ask them, what is it that you don't do or that is not your specialty, not your area of expertise, that I really need to be thinking about? I think that that's a question that people don't ask enough, and it's a really important one. And then basically just taking a look at the chemistry with that person. With regard to accountants, it's the same thing. You need to find accountants and tax advisors who understand startups, who understand your field, who have worked with companies like yours before, in jurisdictions like yours before, and the chemistry needs to be good. So
Right. When a startup founder uh, gets his company registered, how a startup founder can decide that he or she should register it as LLC or C Corp? What are the pros and cons?
sure. So LLC and C Corp, these are two types of forms that you see in the United States. You don't see them in other places. You might have other types of entities that are similar to the LLC or the C Corp, but it's different for every jurisdiction. So just for those who may or may not know, a C corporation, this is a corporation that is considered to be a separate legal entity and a separate entity for tax purposes as well, which means that a corporation is taxed on its profits. And then when those profits are distributed to shareholders, those shareholders are again taxed on their personal taxes. That may or may not be an issue because in tech, a lot of the times, you know, tech companies can be very, very successful and never realize profits, right? So therefore, depending on the situation, that may or may not be a challenge, but it's something to note. Corporations are the type of entity that can ultimately go public, that can have shares where those shares are listed on a stock exchange. That's something that may or may not happen with a startup. And if it does, it probably won't be for many years. But that's another thing to understand about the C Corp format. And it's just a kind of more traditional format. You have shareholders, you have a board of directors, there's established corporate law, and so forth. A limited liability company is a little bit different. It's a more flexible vehicle. First of all, a limited liability company can be taxed either as a C Corp, meaning that one can elect for the LLC to be taxed independently of the individual member who is the owner in the LLC. Just so you understand, in corporation, we call them shareholders. In an LLC, we say members. So the terminology is different as well. An LLC could, however, elect to be taxed as a flow-through entity. So if you have, let's say, two partners, they want to tax their business as a partnership, but they still want to have some sort of a legal wrapper around what it is that they're doing together, they might choose to have an LLC that's taxed as a partnership. You will typically see this more in investment vehicles, fund type vehicles, as opposed to, let's say, startup tech companies, which normally will veer more towards the C Corp. So a lot of it has to do with the tax considerations and the structure, and that's why having a good tax advisor, accountant, is very important, and it's a very good counterpart to having a good lawyer who's looking at the corporate legal issues and is going to be taking a look again at your shareholders agreement and your board resolutions and things like this. So those are really the differences. Overseas, like I said, you have different types of formats. In Switzerland, for example, you have the AG, which is the counterpart to an American corporation, and that's usually the standard type of entity format for a tech startup. Some other things to note is that an LLC can elect to convert to a C corp at a later stage. A C corp cannot elect to avert to become an LLC. So sometimes I've seen situations whereby people start out with an LLC and then they switch the format later. But I would say if you want a cheat sheet, and this isn't legal advice, just information, if you're a US tech startup, the chances that you're going to end up just registering as a C Corp are very, very, very high.
Right. When it comes to hiring an accountant, nowadays there are a lot of apps. I mean, there are kind of startups who say, hey, you don't need to hire an accountant. You just use our app and you can just maintain all of your accounts. Do you recommend that new startups who don't have the budget should use that kind of apps, accountancy apps?
No. I think, look, a big challenge with accounting and tax is that people always underestimate the complexities of it. I think that, there are apps that do it. There are like very small, inexpensive accounting firms that can do kind of general bookkeeping, this sort of thing. From what I've seen, usually with startup founders and companies where you're starting to have a little bit more complexity and more sophistication, this is usually a mistake. It's better to make sure that you're working with somebody who is experienced and who can guide you in the right direction. And I've found that those people who are experienced and who are happy to work with startup founders, and again, it's not just accountants, it's all kinds of advisors, the ones who want to arrange for a long and mutually beneficial relationship, they'll tell their clients when something needs to be handled by them or when the client can just go and take care of something on his own accord. But I would say that those apps, things like that, not really a good idea once you're running a business.
Right. One document is called term sheet when the startup founders are raising funds.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you little bit brief about the term sheet? What things a term sheet cover, and where startup founders should be very very conscious and careful? Do you know the case of Uber? It is said the story is that the investors kicked kicked out the founder of the Uber, and once the Uber founder said investors want to kill the founders. So brief startup founders a little bit about the term sheet and where the startup founders should be careful that what they are signing actually.
Sure. So first of all, this is what goes back to why, it's important to have a good, knowledgeable advisor by your side. And once the company gets to the stage where it's starting to work with venture capital and other types of investment of that size, you should really be looking at more sophisticated counsel and sophisticated law firms that can work with you for the long term. A lot of things in term sheets, they have to do with control. They have to do with decision making. They have to do with regard to dilution and what happens in subsequent rounds. And so those are the areas where founders need to be very careful because they really need to understand, first of all, the financial mechanics of the investment, right? What are they really getting? There are a lot of venture funds that are quite savvy in terms of everything from convertible loans to investment amounts and what they expect. A lot of times, if you actually take a look at what it is that they're offering, it really comes out to looking more like a loan with an interest than an investment. So that's one area that's really important. The other is again control. I was talking earlier about how on the investor side you want to have certain rights, you want to have certain approval rights, you might want to have a board seat, etc. As a founder, obviously you want to maintain control to the founders as much as possible because you don't want a situation whereby if you end up in some sort of a dispute with your board, the other board members win and they're your shareholders. So you have to be very, very careful who you're getting into those relationships with. So those are usually the areas that you want to be really cautious about, and you want to just make sure that you go into any deal with your eyes wide open and really understanding what you're getting into. But I think even taking a step back, a lot of what's on paper, it's critical. And again, it's critical that the founder be educated, understand what the founder is signing, understand what the terms mean. If you don't understand something, don't be afraid to look stupid. Ask again, ask again. It's okay. It's what you're signing. It's your life, right? And then also understanding kind of what are standard terms. Is this market? Is this something that I'm just going to have to accept, right? Or is this something that I shouldn't be accepting? This is really important. And I would say that this is where working with a very reputable firm can be quite important, much more so than in other areas. But the other thing to look at is relationships. When you're taking money from a venture fund or a family office, when you are deciding who the people are going to be who are going to be sharing this journey with you, you need to make sure that there's a lot of trust there, that the chemistry is good, and that you are going to be able to weather the storm in the event of disputes, because disputes do inevitably happen. And sometimes they can be resolved and sometimes they can't, but it's really, all lawsuits, all challenges, everything, it comes down to people, not paperwork.
Right. When it comes to the raising funding, what kind of funding is, I mean, the agreement is most safe? I mean, I don't know how many agreements are there. I came to know it kind of a safe and other also. So, which, I mean, especially for the new startups who are, uh, you know, uh, raising fund for the first time.
Oh gosh, it's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer, to be honest. Safe agreements, and I think they're called KISS agreements. They're great in the beginning because they're simple and they're fast, and startup founders need money and people want to close. They're a little bit convoluted. They can create challenges down the road. I can tell you that, for example, one thing that I learned in the last few years is in Switzerland, because of how the tax code is structured, Switzerland doesn't understand safe agreements. You can't have them. So you can have convertible loans, but it's a little bit different. So that becomes one challenge, is that sometimes simple can become really complicated down the road. But simultaneously, speed is important, getting things done is important. So it's kind of hard to say what the best opportunity is. And also it depends on the terms, right? So if we're looking at convertible loans, if we're looking at convertible notes, you want to understand what those terms are, and if those terms are market, and if they're acceptable. But these things are generally, pretty well accepted across the board. So
Right. So, what happens? I mean, suppose a startup raise funds, all the cash is burnt, startup failed. Now what? Startup
Get
founder
it?
has to return.
Look, I mean, part of making investments is taking risks, right? And part of starting a business is taking a risk. So companies fail all the time, all the time. And that goes back to people. So if you're an investor, when you're investing, especially in early stage companies, you don't know if the business is going to be successful. You don't know what's going to happen. You can't predict the next 10 years. No one has a crystal ball. But what you can do is you can make good educated guesses, in particular, not just based on amazing idea and amazing tech, which is two big parts of it, but also just amazing team. And especially if you know that you're working with a team that has failed in the past, and looks at how that team has pivoted during a failure, or how that team has managed to be successful in spite of challenges, that can be a really good indicator that you're working with really, really great people. That might not happen all the time because a lot of founders are young, they're new, they haven't had a chance to prove themselves, but it is one element to look at. I think that investors are always looking at people, because even if a founder fails, let's say, and doesn't pivot, but the founder fails at their first startup, if it's a good founder, they might be successful at the second one. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And obviously with venture capital, it's a crapshoot, right? That's why venture capitalists, they're always looking for unicorns and decacorns that can go ahead and pay out for all the transgressions of the fund. And for startup founders, look, first of all, don't go buck wild with your budgets in the beginning. I see it a lot of the time. People spend money on things they don't need to be spending money on. Be lean, even if you feel like you don't need to be. Even if you're like, oh, I have all this cash, be lean. It's good. It's good discipline. I think it's really important, especially now in this economic climate, seeing what's happening with so many tech companies. Knowing how to be lean, knowing how to be agile can be really an advantage. And ultimately, see if you're able to pivot, if you're able to do something else, if you're able to take your company's assets and somehow work with them. And if all else fails, try another company, or get a job.
Right. Uh, Katya, trust me, it was really insightful talking to you. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of startup founders and a lot of entrepreneurs will learn a lot of things out of this podcast. And I'm really thankful to you for joining today.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. So
But
I
before
hope.
you go, as usual, I would love you to give an inspirational message to the young entrepreneurs, university students, and the community in general, that any inspirational message that could make them motivated and make them able to get their dreams what they actually want to do.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I guess I'll say a few things. Number one, your fear of looking stupid is what makes you look stupid. A lot of times I see people who lack confidence, and they feel that they can't do the things that they want to be doing, or they can't be in the place that they want to be because they lack the skills or the knowledge, or even the title, frankly. I see it a lot. And ultimately it's fear. They don't want to look like they don't know what they're doing. They don't want to look dumb. Who cares? It doesn't matter. No one's going to remember anything tomorrow anyway. Nobody's really paying attention to you. So whatever it is that you want to do, just go ahead and just do it. Right? And over time, you'll fool enough people into thinking that you know what you're doing, and then you'll end up in a position like mine.
All right, it was really amazing